Yui and Hartwig, thank you for the invitation. I'm honoured. I'm going to refer to three forms of space. Space in the landscape, space in type of building, in social kind of implications of type, and the space in a wall. So Chadwick Hall was a modest commission for student housing in a fairly remarkable setting, and it's made, I suppose, or was made in a place that had two significant layers of social and architectural history. One of 18th century parkland houses and gardens, and the other of 20th century welfare state social housing. And in the early part of the 18th century, a new bridge was built, a river crossing across the Thames in the west, and brought with it wealth to what was open countryside, and with that, houses and gardens by English architects, eminent architects, Archer, Chambers, Wyatt, whose names you may have heard of, and landscapes where the garden, I suppose, was mediating, the space of the garden was mediating between the house and the parkland, between man and nature. Landscapes like these. And then in the 20th century, in the 1950s, the London County Council, the London local government architects made a master plan for an extraordinary estate of housing, the Alton West Estate. And they did something, they co-opted the 18th century parkland into a setting for social housing. I guess changed that perhaps more prosaic or utilitarian aspect of the housing, and in the process also recast the villas that had been built within that landscape as follies. So this space was changing, as it were, and an artist, well, the local government also commissioned a whole series of pieces of public art which they placed into this landscape. And this one by Lynn Chadwick has this curious condition. The work is called The Watchers, and it's their very gaze that in a sense realizes the space of the landscape. Some architects who went on to set up quite an important practice in the UK at the time, Howell, Killick, Partridge and Amis, under the guises of the LCC, made these Corbusian slab blocks to the modular after Bill Howell's visit to Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation in Marseille. And these were completed in 1958. Now our site sits, well, I should say our site, is that going to work? Yeah, so here's our site at what is effectively the head of a vale of this 1950s estate, with the villas set within this landscape as follies. So our site was the gardens of Downshire House, a house built in the late 18th century, and in the early the grounds of this house, in fact, extended far further to the west and to the south, and there was another house to the north with wings by John Soane, and a field boundary of trees separating the two. And in the early part of the 20th century, that house was demolished. This family took this land and extended their garden into it. And an architect called Milne made these interventions. So I guess what we found is a landscape consisting of a house and the vestiges of a garden, the field boundary, but of course by the time we saw it, it was like this. And I suppose what was interesting was the idea actually that the garden could make space, and our, I guess our work in a way was sort of the third generation or the third evolution into this landscape. And one that was using the landscape structure, the spatial structure of the landscape, to make a master plan, to give structure to a kind of accommodation, a kind of existence minimum accommodation, which so often is so utilitarian, has no social structure. And so we were able to, in a way, borrow the structure of the garden to bring scale and a social structure to these groups of students who were going to live in the garden. And so we placed that, we were just looking at that space there, massively overgrown. And so we were able to place a building on each side and to make a room, an interior in effect, although outside. And you can see that this building stretches as far as it can to shape that space, to make that space. And we made connection. This is a retaining wall from the early part of the 20th century. And then we articulated this plan around that. And you can see that what we're starting to do is we're drawing on the 18th century language of the Baroque plan here and the 20th century language of the sort of second generation unités, which is to the left. And then down here we make, as it were, we reinvent a lost wing to the house and use the terrace in front of the house to create an axial relationship between this pair of buildings and this building, which is, as it were, loosely tethered at the other end of that, leaving the house open to the space of the valley or the vale to the west. And these adjustments, as it were, to the plan, this field boundary trees and the extent of the roots meant that we were able to exaggerate the shape of these elements. And so the plan, the composition evolves as a series of interrelationships, an interrelationship between the northeast building and the wall and the court and the sunken garden and the summer house. And similarly then a relationship, of course, between both of these buildings and that space. But equally a relationship between this villa and the original villa and the sunken garden and the terrace. And this completed then with this tethered, as it were, rediscovered wing of the original house. And so this sunken garden then becomes a court between these buildings. And then typologically, each of these buildings takes on a very distinct character, one from the, as it were, the 18th century, one from the 20th century, and one sort of negotiating between the two. And it was a kind of, we were curious, as you'll see in various ways, about how we might draw on those two histories, formally, typologically, and materially, but also in the process of doing that, in a way, actually solving very mundane problems. So this step in the plan of the retaining wall, in a way, invited this idea of creating a country house plan with wings, but also the pulling these forwards as much as the pushing those back meant that, as you'll see from the street, this building appears to be much smaller. So we're in the context of a kind of historic setting where that, was important. I suppose, so it's kind of historic context gave us the excuse for the narrative, the opportunity for this narrative about time. And then even more kind of curiously, just issues of light and overshadowing, meaning that one wing of this house and one wing, the other wing, are not even the same height. And then from the street, those wings disappear and the building becomes a much smaller thing. And then the relationship that it becomes a picturesque relationship between the central body of the building, this wing, and then the articulation of the house, which are not quite orthogonal, very slightly rotated. Of course, perspective and so on all adds to the kind of plausible relationship between these two things, both formal and informal. And the sort of finding the social structure was in part also to do with deciding how people were going to live. So that first villa, as it were, was a row of 6 townhouses where all the living space was on the ground, whereas here the living spaces are on the ends, and that reflects the kind of open landscape that this building opens up to the west. So it frames this edge, but then extends out into the landscape. There's no right answer, sort of socially, to the structure that you give, but there's a kind of anatomy which invites certain experiences or certain kind of associations. So this is its sort of formal elevation facing the other building, and this is its relationship to the open landscape, this finer building that has more in common with the 1950s buildings that it faces. And then the third building started not only a kind of an idea about its planning, but also an idea about how we started to kind of detail the building. So this is William Chambers' pagoda in Kew, the gardens close to Roehampton. And this is a house, even closer, Parkstead House, which was reputed to have an octagonal timber staircase in it. And we kind of started to pursue the idea of the octagon as an element of space, and an element of form, and an element of detail, and a practical idea. It takes the form of bay windows here, it takes the form of the staircase here, it takes the form of the inverted bays here. This is the north side, so it brings light in, it's completely logical. Of course, the staircases are things we wanted people to dwell on, so they're either octagonal or square. So they are places, or they're rooms, I suppose, they're rooms. And similarly here, we made a plan of 2 apartments and paired the communal spaces around the door, and of course orientated them back to the other building. So there's that kind of logic that even though these people are as remote as within reason they could be, physically, dimensionally, we brought the 2 communal rooms on each floor close to the entrance, almost like a gatehouse overlooking the comings and goings, but also orientated towards the other houses. And so you can see the articulation of the geometry starting to manifest itself in the bays and the inverted bays, but also in the columns and other details, and the staircase inside. So we're using, we were using the structure, as it were, the spatial structure of the landscape to devise a master plan, something that would, a kind of latent structure, as is often the case in the landscape. It's not immediately obvious and can be reread in a number of different ways. The space within the buildings offers some social structure and some relationship to the landscape, some orientation to the landscape. But the area, I suppose, that became most interesting to us was the space of the wall. In fact, the wall and the way we build. And here's the house within our grounds, built in the 1770s, and here is one of the blocks within the Alton West Estate, built in the 1950s. And they're essentially the same, in as much as they look how they're built. One is walls, and the other is a frame. And we were kind of curious about, and slightly frustrated by the ambiguity or the lack of purpose in making walls, and how that might then lead to a whole series of kind of experiences that one might have. And so, in conversation with the Vice-Chancellor, the kind of head of the university, we talked about kind of that threshold between the room and the landscape. And he was really enthusiastic about the students having a really strong connection with the landscape. And that enabled us to develop an idea where essentially a trabeated structure would be not so much walls, but a simple structure of brick piers and concrete stones or beams spanning between the piers, leaving the void of the French window. And something which might be from certain angles open and from other views closed, which only serves to kind of reinforce the material simplicity, but also the depth of the wall. And so the students, I guess, these rooms they're very small rooms. The kind of potential for enriching that experience, we realized, was in the threshold. It wasn't really within the space. It was within the threshold between the space and the landscape. And so by doing that, also to orientate them and reorientate them to that landscape. And in a practical sense, and there are fairly conventional construction. It's fairly conventional construction on the inside, concrete frame which is insulated and made airtight and watertight and so on. But then outside it, in effect, ruins. Cold construction, completely independent, load-bearing in itself, trying to reclaim the idea that a building is palpably built, visibly built, but also to spatialize, and that comes partly, it's not absolutely necessary, but it was in part to do with the stability of the wall, enable us to spatialize this space, to create the threshold between inside and outside. And so to make, as it were, literally ruins that could almost exist completely independently of the interiors. Technically, they could exist completely independently. But I guess kind of intellectually, they exist completely independently. And they were built kind of out of sequence. So we kind of built two buildings. We built a fairly conventional series of buildings on the inside, and then in this historic context of both 20th and 18th century buildings, we were able to justify this kind of laborious, hand-laid, slow progression of the making of walls, which then make the spaces, and so this order becomes, I suppose, the foil or rather the landscape, and that field boundary becomes the foil to this repetitive order. I'm not going, no, sorry. And the students are reorientated to that landscape and strongly connected. And I guess a lot of our work in the past has been when I say for institutions, I suppose I mean things like schools and people who share a heritage and share values and ultimately congregate. And one of the kind of curious things about this building, or these buildings, is it's cellular. There are congregation spaces in the form of the kitchen, but of course they're not congregating spaces for 200 people. So the landscape became, as it were, the implied space of congregation. But also, we were trying to exploit what we might describe as common experience through the shared private experience of these spaces. And so the wall, the threshold between inside and out, distilled to its absolute bare minimum, is fired clay, cast concrete, space and shadow. And this, for us, this project, I suppose, has been something that's resulted in a reflection, a reflection backwards and a projection forwards, and a way of thinking, as say our kind of maybe I didn't say, but our preoccupation has been the plan and the typologies of buildings and that sense of congregation and disaggregation, that we are individual sentient beings, but we're also social animals, and that doesn't necessarily correlate with space, but it's episodic, or it's ritualistic. So we ebb and flow between types of space and forms of kind of experience, congregation and as it were, sentient isolation. But this project made us aware that the threshold has been an important part of our work. So if I may, I'll just read briefly something that is in a way a summary of a paper I gave in KU Leuven with a slightly different emphasis, but something which has real, because it's about the same project, continuity. So our facade studies stemmed first from the adaptation of buildings, with the outside world often framed by the work to be inner space, to use your phrase. Cloisters, courts and yards was arguably of more interest than the literal interiors. This led us to rethink the thresholds of buildings. We would superimpose a plausible typological reading that was dependent on the reciprocal connection between building and landscape, be that a garden or a greater landscape. But any typological rereading was only possible with adjustments to the wall and the liminal space within and immediately beyond the wall. Chadwick demonstrates the way in which construction can once again be perceptible, appropriate and approximate instead of performative, technocratic and laminate. It's possible for a wall or a facade to convey meaning through its composition and construction, and so to be understood for what it is, not to stupefy. We comprehend it due to its construction, to its potential for inhabitation, its capacity to orientate the inhabitant to the world outside and to the elements, and so to demystify the environment. The facade's capacity to expose each of us to natural phenomena, consciousness breeds conscience, is in complete opposition to the prevailing technocratic response to the environment and the amoral citizen consumer of buildings and space. Finally, the liminal properties of a wall translate the facade into a form of social infrastructure. The wall will continue to be a conundrum, for us at least, but to focus on the facade as a space and its generative potential in the design of buildings, type, construction, inhabitation, orientation to the natural world, and as a role as social infrastructure, for us reactivates the ethics of both the wall and building. Thank you.